excited to welcome Stefan Schindler to our most elaborate International Day of Peace festivities ever. And I thank Esther and Aliyah, who are the current UDRs and facts, for having put this together. They have extraordinary energy, great imagination, and I'm just deeply impressed and indebted to you. Thank you. Stefan.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm still not convinced this microphone works. Is it working?
Yeah, you just have to speak close up to it.
I think we can make it a little higher.
No, it'll be all right. It'll be okay.
All right, good.
Thank you, Gordon. I'd like to thank Brandeis University for inviting me here to speak. Louis, you're here. Pardon me, ladies and gentlemen. I was outside. I was worried. I'm so pleased. Founder and director of the Peace Abbey. Louis and I have been friends and colleagues for 6,000 years. So, I'd like to thank Brandeis University for inviting me here to speak today on the International Day of Peace to celebrate the symposium on ecology, peace, and survival. I'd like to thank Esther and Aliyah especially for all their hard work in organizing this event and making it possible. I see Esther. Where's Aliyah? Hey, there you go. All right. I'd like to thank Gordon and Costa for joining me in the panel discussion. Thank you, gentlemen. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I appreciate your presence. Take a deep breath, exhale slowly, clear your mind, open your heart, enjoy the ride. Now, before we get to the heavy lifting, I'd like to offer 3 simple things which you can take home with you after this event. First, how do you catch a squirrel? Climb a tree and act like a nut. 2, what's the difference between erotic and kinky? Erotic is using a feather, kinky is using the whole chicken. And number 3, what did the doe say when she came out of the woods? That's the last time I'll do that for $2. So on that note then, as you know, my name is Stefan Schindler. I'm on the board of directors of the Life Experience School in Peace Abbey, and I teach philosophy at Salem State University. And I'm very privileged to be here today. I'd like to begin with a passage from William Bloom's new book, Freeing the World to Death. It's called, If I Were President, If I Were President. So I'm going to quote William Bloom, and then I'll launch into my lecture. Quote, if I were the president, I could stop terrorist attacks against the United States in a few days, permanently. I would first apologize, very publicly and very sincerely, to all the widows and orphans, the impoverished and the tortured, and all the many millions of other victims of American imperialism. Then I would announce to every corner of the world that America's global military interventions have come to an end. Then I would reduce the military budget by at least 90% and use the savings to pay reparations to the victims and repair the damage from the many American bombings, invasions, and sanctions. There would be more than enough money. 1 year's military budget in the United States is equal to more than $20,000 per hour for every hour since Jesus Christ was born. That's 1 year. That's what I would do on my first 3 days in the White House. On the 4th day, I'd be assassinated. And now my talk for today is entitled, as most of you know, excuse me, Trifecta from Hell, Disfoliation, Proliferation, Klepto-Capitalism. I'm recuperating from an illness, and so I'm just getting my voice and my lucidity back, so bear with me while I pause occasionally take a drink of water. Trifecta from hell. Disfoliation, proliferation. Oh, here's water. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Disfoliation, proliferation, Klepto-Capitalism. Part 1, Pleiades children. Between about 2200 and 800 BC, the mysterious Indo-European invaders, who called themselves Aryan, meaning noble, migrated south and west from the plains of Central Asia into India and Greece. Singing Vedic hymns, they brought with them a male-oriented way of life, and in particular, a patriarchal and transcendent, otherworldly theism. Evidence indicates that prior to the Aryan invasions, the people of India and Greece lived in matriarchal civilizations. Divinity was primarily female, polymorphous, immanent, animistic, and pervasive, not male and not transcendent. Before the Aryan invasions, India and Greece apparently lived in nature-worshipping cultures lasting back centuries, if not millennia. They embraced a spirituality of organic interbeing, honoring mothers and Mother Earth, because nature and women do what divinity does, give birth. Men can't do that. That's why men are tempted to feel jealous and inferior. To compensate, too many men bully women, bully nature, and compete with each other to be king of the hill. And now, here we are, with nuclear weapons, nuclear waste, and nuclear proliferation, as religious hatred and shrinking resources provoke the dogs of war. Equally ominous, we are, environmentally, about to lose our one and only spaceship. How sane is that? Women's liberation should really be called women's liberation should really be called men's liberation. Men's liberation is our only hope for survival. There is, of course, no going back. We hurtle toward the future. Fortunately, the women's liberation movement came along just in time, joining hands with the peace movement, the civil rights movement, the environment movement, the voluntary simplicity movement, a new age, Aquarian, egalitarian. If this deepening and widening of our Emersonian circle of compassion is successful, arrogant men will be healed of their sickness and do what Rabbi Hillel advised when asked to summarize the Torah: treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. From the Golden Rule, through Kant's categorical imperative, to Martin Buber's I and Thou, love is, or ought to be, our guiding light. In sum, to become oneself, one has to go beyond oneself. But it is also important to be a self, a well-rounded and well-grounded self, so that one is not simply a puppet in someone else's power game. This takes balance, centering, and self-transcendence, dancing the yin and yang. Think the serpentine middle pillar on the Kabbalistic tree of life. Our survival depends on the preservation of the forest, the trees. Indeed, we are like trees, rooted in a common earth and growing toward heaven. Philosophy is the journey from the love of wisdom to the wisdom of love. And monopolytheism is no more self-contradictory than the colors of a rainbow. Part 2, the Vietnam War. memory, and imagination. President Obama gave a speech on Memorial Day, May 28, 2012, in front of the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. He announced a 13-year project entitled the Vietnam War Commemoration. Obama's speech was delivered to a cheering, very carefully selected group of Vietnam veterans. The alleged purpose of the project is to rehabilitate the image of Vietnam veterans in America's collective consciousness. The 13-year extravaganza will consist of a series of well-funded national and local events. These events will number in the thousands. And I'll just pause just ever so briefly. Ladies, come on in. There's a seat here and a seat there and a seat here. So you've got 3 choices, at least. And that includes, if you want to sit, there's 3 chairs, please.
There are also more chairs that I can.
And Leah is setting up some more chairs in the back, so we'll be cool. Good timing. Thank you, Ellie. Okay, the 13-year Vietnam War Commemoration Campaign will consist of a series of well-funded national and local events. As announced by President Obama, these events will number in the thousands. The Vietnam War Commemoration Campaign was an idea spawned in the devil's womb of the Bush-Cheney administration. Dick Cheney, of course, avoided military service in the 1960s, claiming that he had, quote, other priorities. George W. Bush, thanks to his father's influence, avoided shipment overseas and combat duty by serving, if you can call it that, in the Air National Guard. The Vietnam War Commemoration Campaign was approved and funded by Congress in the 2008 Fiscal Appropriations Act. The campaign was launched in 2012 to mark the 50th anniversary of the start of the Vietnam War in 1962. Claiming that the Vietnam War started in 1962 allows Republicans to blame the war on President John F. Kennedy. But, in fact, the Vietnam War did not start in 1962. Its various starting points stretch from 1. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964, leading to President Johnson's invasion of Vietnam in March of 1965 and the launching of the longest bombing campaign in history. Back through 2. The January 30th, 1964 Pentagon coup in Saigon that overthrew the post-Diem South Vietnamese government, which offered wide-ranging negotiations for peace, including withdrawal of U.S. troops, multi-party democratic elections, and peaceful reunification of the country. Back through 3. The murders of Ngo Dinh Diem and President Kennedy just weeks earlier, November 1963, climaxing the bloodthirsty absurdity of American-sponsored military dictatorship in South Vietnam. Back through 4. The spring of 1954, when the French lost their 8-year war against Vietnam, leading to President Eisenhower's subversion of the summer 1954 Geneva Peace Accords, and his 1955 installation of Diem's military tyranny and the training of his Gestapo-like secret police. Back further to 5. President Truman's helping the French in 1946 do to the Vietnamese what the Nazis had just done to them, thus beginning France's second Indochina War. And finally, all the way back to 6, the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, when President Wilson refused to accept the hand of friendship offered by Ho Chi Minh. You'll notice that 1962 is not among the viable candidates for telling something truthful about the intrinsically absurd notion of the start of America's Vietnam War, which ought rightly to be called America's Indochina Holocaust. What did occur in 1962 is President John F. Kennedy's launching an American bombing campaign in South Vietnam to support a regime installed by Eisenhower that could not defend itself against the social democratic insurgency of its mostly Buddhist and oppressed population of villagers, rice farmers, and fishermen. It is also important to note what Kennedy did not do. In Vietnam, as in Cuba, Laos, and Berlin, Kennedy defied the Joint Chiefs of Staff into a storm of congressional criticism and most of his advisors. He refused to deploy American ground troops in Asia. He refused to pull the trigger for war. The starting point for understanding America's 30-year war on Southeast Asia is to place it in its proper time frame, 1945 to 1975. Obama's complicity in rewriting American history is enough to make Martin Luther King wonder if he died in vain. The Vietnam War Commemoration Campaign will climax in 2025, the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. In 1975, National Liberation Front and North Vietnamese soldiers finally brought down the South Vietnamese dictatorship forcibly implanted by the United States in 1955 by President Eisenhower. In his memoirs, President Eisenhower confesses to installing an unelected, Catholic, militaristic, plutocratic, megalomaniac monarch named Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam, whose brother ran a CIA-trained secret police, to rule a mostly Buddhist South Vietnam in order to prevent the 1956 democratic elections to unify North and South. Eisenhower admits that Ho Chi Minh, the George Washington of Vietnam, would have won about 80% of the vote in 1956 if that had been conducted according to the peace accords promised in Geneva in 1954 at the end of the French War. The 1956 Vietnamese democratic elections had been promised in the 1954 Geneva Peace Accords following the defeat of the U.S. taxpayer-financed post-World War II French attempt to reclaim its empire in Southeast Asia. After an 8-year war against the people of Vietnam, starting in 1946, France was decisively beaten at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the spring of 1954. During the siege of the hopelessly isolated French fort, John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, offered the French 2, some say 4, atomic bombs. The French declined the offer. America's Vietnam War soon followed, first by proxy, then directly, repeating history's march of folly. The Pentagon's Vietnam War Commemoration Campaign, like Obama's speech, is deeply flawed by absence of reference to relevant facts. 1, the immorality of America's Vietnam War. 2, the lies that launched the war. 3, the war crimes that were so much a part of the war. 4, the near genocidal suffering of the peoples of Indochina, the Vietnam War being in fact America's Indochina Holocaust, killing upwards of 5 million children, women, and men as Laos and Cambodia were sucked into the vortex. 5, that over 100,000 Vietnamese, twice the number of American soldiers killed in World War II, have been killed or maimed by bombs and mines left scattered over the Vietnamese landscape since American troops left nearly 40 years ago. 6. America's refusal to pay $3 billion in reparations promised by President Richard Nixon in order to obtain a January 1973 Paris Peace Accord. Vietnam waived the right to reparations as a condition for President Clinton's lifting America's vengeance in 1995, the punishing post-war 20-year embargo against Vietnam, which some say inflicted more suffering than the war itself. 7. The breakdown and disintegration of U.S. armed forces due to the mutiny of American troops who refused to be part of the killing machine. 8. The soaring cancer rates inflicted on the Vietnamese people and American soldiers resulting from America's international law-defying war crime, the use of chemical warfare, Agent Orange. 9. The longest and largest anti-war protest movement in American history, whose insight and purpose history proved correct. 10. World opinion, which saw and still sees America's assault on Southeast Asia. America dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all the bombs dropped in World War II, as a war crime against humanity, evidenced by the 1967 War Crimes Tribunals headed by Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell in Stockholm and Copenhagen. 11. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War, collective voice of conscience and acts of political courage. 12. Military and CIA complicity in supplying heroin to American troops. 13. The Nixon-Kissinger 5-year apocalyptic firestorm, in which more bombs were dropped on Vietnam during any 9-day period in Nixon's first term in office than all the bombs dropped in Vietnam in Lyndon Johnson's entire 5-year reign. 14. That Vietnam was America's ally in World War II, helping us to defeat the Japanese. 15. That launching a war against Vietnam was not only an ethical betrayal of an ally, it was logically absurd, inasmuch as the declared purpose of the war, to prevent communist Chinese expansion into Southeast Asia, would have been best served by America's continued alliance with the fiercely independent Vietnamese who had been fighting China for 2,000 years and asking for the hand of American friendship since the Versailles Peace Conference of 1919. And 16, that the American people were overwhelmingly opposed to the Vietnam War after the 1968 Vietnamese New Year's Tet Offensive made stunningly clear the lies, futility, and consequences of American war policy, confirmed a year later by the revelation of the My Lai massacre. These are just 16 items that will not be mentioned in the Vietnam War commemoration campaign. The hidden agenda of the Vietnam War commemoration campaign is to take the crimes, lies, and lessons of the Vietnam War and disappear them down the memory hole, in order to make space for igniting a renewed pride in America's warrior spirit. In short, to humiliate humility while still claiming to be a Judeo-Christian nation. Disneyfying the Vietnam War replaces history with fantasy. The Department of Defense will distribute their censored version of the war to cities and towns across the country, who will be encouraged to show their patriotism with school events, park events, town hall events, parades, concerts, flags, songs, memorial testimonies, billboards, national and patriotic holiday tie-ins, media advertising, free commemoration medallions, patches, and posters, and selected revisionist speakers from politics, business, and the military. Expect a flood of right-wing editorials, books, TV dramas, and John Wayne wet dream Top Gun movies. The planned festivities are a Pentagon propaganda campaign consciously and conscientiously designed to keep American citizens in Plato's cave. As an instrument in the national security state's arsenal of WMDs, weapons of mass dysfunction, it is Orwell's 1984 come true. The campaign's war-glorifying intent exhibits the merging of Truman's secret government, the National Security Council and Central Intelligence Agency, with Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, the Pentagon in bed with big business, morphing into the Frankenstein's monster Eisenhower helped create, then cautioned us to watch with vigilance our democracy at stake. The commemoration kaleidoscope of heroic imagery and patriotic fervor seeks to seduce the next generation of American youth into sacrificing their lives in the upcoming wars in which they will be used again as intentionally ignorated, taxpayer-financed thugs for America's richest corporations. Our dear, miseducated, and supposedly Judeo-Christian children will be offered up and sacrificed on the altar of American military adventurism to perpetuate a moral contradiction called democratic imperialism, whose folly mirrors the Athenian fleet sailing to Syracuse in the pivot point of the Peloponnesian War. The VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, still active, is launching a people's counter-campaign to educate and illumine the American people. It is called the Vietnam War Commemoration Correction Project. The goal of this people's counter-campaign is to keep America's memory honest. You'll remember the title of this section is The Vietnam War, Memory and Imagination. The goal of this people's counter-campaign is to keep America's memory honest, to keep us tethered to our history and the lessons therein. And as we hurtle toward a trifecta from hell, diminishing resources, nuclear proliferation, and global klepto-capitalism, hopefully keep America somewhere in the moral ballpark. Concerned citizens, teachers, and veterans of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan can activate their courage of conscience by dialogue with family, students, and friends. To honor the memory and sacrifice of American troops in Vietnam, the living and the dead, the traumatized in body and soul, we must tell the truth about how they were betrayed by their leaders and by the institutions of their culture. The light of this truth is our only hope for dismantling the war machine, committing to peace, and never again asking our youth for such deluded, death-dealing obedience. We can educate, love, and revere our children instead, and thus collectively act as a nation as a beacon of hope for the world. Part 3, illustrative quotes. Reporter, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? Gandhi, I think it would be a good idea. Noam Chomsky, the problem is not that people don't know, it's that they don't know they don't know. Karl Kraus, the great Viennese journalist in between the two world wars, Karl Kraus. How do wars start? Politicians lie to journalists, then believe what they read. Mark Twain. America's flag should be a skull and crossbones. They didn't teach you Mark Twain said that in school, did they? No. He said that during America's Philippine War in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and America's first 8-year Vietnam War in Asia. If you want to memorize it, I'll say it again. Mark Twain. America's flag should be a skull and crossbones, which, as you know, is the flag of pirates. And what is piracy? Terrorism. And I'm a little bit embarrassed that Salem State University sports teams are all called Vikings. Because the word Salem means peace. It comes from the same root as shalom. The peaceful Vikings. Imagine. All right, to continue with the illustrative quotes. Alfred North Whitehead, the great British-American philosopher who taught at Harvard, quote, "Boring teachers should be brought to trial for the murder of young souls." Some of you like that, I'll repeat it. Alfred North Whitehead. Boring teachers should be brought to trial for the murder of young souls. H.G. Wells. History is more and more a race between education and catastrophe. Mike Marcuse. The battles of the 60s may someday come to seem merely an early skirmish in a conflict whose dimensions we have yet to grasp. Karl Marx. The demand to abandon illusions about our condition is a demand to abandon the conditions which require illusion. I'm going to say that again. Karl Marx. The demand to abandon illusions about our condition is a demand to abandon the conditions which require illusion. Richard Rorty, the most famous Western philosopher on the planet in the last 40 years. I don't know whether democracy can survive the gangsterism that now controls America. Also, the religious right is a truly dangerous, potentially fascist movement. Put the two together, an economic mafia with Christian fundamentalism, and there is a crisis coming. I hope that's not the crisis coming through.
Stand back.
Normally lights blink and bells go off, and I can say the gods agree, but... All right. Nagarjuna, a 2nd century Buddhist sage, said to an Indian king, "Do not build 50 palaces, Your Highness. After all, you can only be in one room at a time." Francis MacDonald Cornford, the great Cambridge Platonist from early in the 20th century, quote, "O wise and gentle humanist, in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten more than it has learnt since Athens fell, the spirit of Socrates can live again." Chief Seattle, "What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves." Emerson, "I am God in nature. I am a weed by the wall." I'm going to repeat that. Emerson, "I am God in nature. I am a weed by the wall." John Lennon, "I am the walrus." Michael Parenti paraphrase, "It is better to swim against the current than to be swept over the cliff." President Harry Truman, "I look with pity on my fellow Americans who, reading the newspaper each day, think they have some understanding of what is going on in the world. Justice Louis Brandeis. We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great concentrated wealth in the hands of a few. We cannot have both. And to articulate the obvious, ladies and gentlemen, today we have great concentrated wealth in the hands of a few. So if Justice Louis Brandeis were here today, you know what he would say about the state of our democracy, so-called, and the reforms that need to be instituted, namely regulation of Wall Street and the closing of corporate tax loopholes. In general, social democratic legislation. And I have 28 proposals listed in a sheet that I brought with me just in case the panel discussion leads to that later on. And it's not part of my speech, but if you want to hear them, you know, because you're invited as part of the panel discussion after this, right? So if you remember and you want to hear them, I could run through them real quickly, so, okay. All right. So to conclude, illustrative quotes. Schindlerian maxims. 1. The primary function of American education is to ignorate. 2. Individual innocence is no protection against collective responsibility. I hope I don't have to remind you of 9/11. Right? Individual innocence is no protection against collective responsibility. 3. The truth will set you free, but first it will break your heart. 4. You can't be a peacemaker if you're walking around in a rage all the time. So I think some of the things I'm saying today will enrage you if you didn't know them already. And so in the spirit of that last Schindlerian maxim, it's why I started with a little humor at the beginning just to balance it out, and why we did meditation as well. You know? Because again, it's always that balance. Okay, part 4. 2 poems. 1. The Battle for Your Mind. What the media want you to think versus what you need to know in order to know how to think. I'll repeat that. What the media want you to think versus what you need to know in order to know how to think. Poem number 2, The Sting. Aphrodite's sting is the sweetest pain. All the birds sing, and there's no such thing as love in vain as you fall into your lover's arms. All their charms on you they showered, and now you can hardly wait to be devoured. You freely followed the route to forbidden fruit. So are you or are you not just another slut marching toward the abyss with eyes wide shut? We can talk later about why I threw that in. I always think there's parallels between personal and collective experience. Okay, part 5, hope. We are, I suggest, in the beginning stages of a radical civilizational transformation, a global metamorphosis. The old order is breaking down, and a new world order, if we survive, will appear, and our children will have the future they deserve. Imagine that human history can be understood in terms of 3 essential epochs: pre-personal, personal, and transpersonal. We are on the cusp of the 3rd, having gone from one extreme to the other, from pre-subjective, multimodal creatures of nature to one-dimensional, hyper-calculating egomaniacs. We must now learn the art of synthesis, becoming authentic, whole-brain subjects rooted in transpersonal reverence for the primacy of interbeing. Those who have read the work of Nahan know that he has used this word interbeing and has encouraged us to use it because it is one of the chief discoveries of quantum theory and relativity theory. Modern physics has essentially proven the fact of interbeing. As Chief Seattle knew, what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. There is no separation ultimately. And as Thich Nhat Hanh says, if we use the word often enough, maybe it'll finally get into the dictionary. And then maybe our children will have a sense of interbeing and treat each other and the earth with the respect that is appropriate. In short, so just remember, pre-personal, personal, transpersonal. We are on the cusp of the third. So in short, my thesis is, ego's emergence in history was necessary, but ego's historical destiny is to transcend itself. The emergence of authentic selfhood is a long developmental process. It is agonistic, oppressed and persecuted by social institutions. For example, the church closed Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, the first two Western universities, in 529. This was followed by 1,000 years of terror, tyranny, and superstition, called the Middle Ages, also called the Dark Ages. And now you see why, right? Climaxing in a centuries-long Inquisition. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600, simply for postulating what modern physics is now postulating, a multiverse. Galileo was threatened with torture in 1633 for refusing to repudiate his Copernican-inspired discoveries about the planets, motion, and the moon. History's agony is also clear in the Muslim invasion of India, about 1000 CE, leading to the burning of the great Buddhist university of Nalanda. Nalanda's temple campus was several hundred times larger than Plato's Academy. It was the greatest garden of wisdom the world has ever seen. Its Buddhist light spread across India, liberating women and undermining the Hindu caste system, making India festive, prosperous, pacifist, and desirable. The burning to the ground of the University of Nalanda was the work of Muhammad al-Guhari. Al-Guhari's sweep across India in 1192 destroyed other Buddhist communities, which, like Nalanda, included monasteries, libraries, meditation halls, and debating centers. In other words, the instruments of peace. By the end of the 12th century, Buddhism had all but disappeared from the land of its birth. Al-Guhari's destruction of the University of Nalanda repeats the Christian burning of the great library at Alexandria several centuries earlier. History, however, is not without a sense of irony. The Muslims are inspired to build their own gardens of wisdom, their own philosophic and scientific institutions, adorned with fountains, flowers, poets, calligraphers, aqueducts, and alchemists, the accumulated learning of which is discovered by the West in the Christian reconquest of Spain, the capture of Toledo's libraries in 1089, sparking the emergence of Western culture from its long, dark night of the soul. Plato and Aristotle come alive again in the Western imagination. Socratic dialogue, scientific investigation, artistic creativity, and political protest re-blossom in the Renaissance, progressing from the Gutenberg press through the Enlightenment toward the modern triumph of the self-consciously free individual. But even this modern triumph is at best a tender and provisional achievement, barely present in large parts of the world, and opposed by potent forces in even the freest societies. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, echoing Epictetus and Rousseau, cautioned against the seductions and dangers of herd mentality. They were prophets of the Matrix. America is, in fact, a high-tech version of Plato's cave. Citizens are educated into ignorance, the people's consent to participate in America's national security state empire is manufactured by the artful deployment of weapons of mass dysfunction. The puppeteers, those who control, are experts at deception, distortion, and distraction. This is why I invented the verb to ignorate. Why William Blake refers to our mind-forged manacles. Why Erich Fromm coined the phrase chains of illusion. Why Herbert Marcuse critiques Western culture as one-dimensional. Why Immanuel Kant refers to our self-imposed immaturity. Why Michael Parenti says our schools owe more to Sparta than to Athens. Why Chomsky says we don't even know that we don't know. Why Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz. And why Gore Vidal has given us a new name, the United States of Amnesia. Recollect the slogan, "United we stand." It was effectively used after 9/11 to launch a second Vietnam War, this time in the Middle East. While Wall Street bankers prepared to give us the worst stock market crash since 1929, from which we have yet to recover, as you know, and as your student debt to the banks, right? Student debt in America, student debt has now surpassed the overall total credit card debt. It's well over $1 trillion. If I were president, college and graduate school education would be free, as it is in Scandinavia and in the enlightened Northern European countries. Free in the sense that we have already paid a fortune in tax dollars, and those tax dollars should be used for the people, including health care and education. We've already paid for it. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me on that. Let me just repeat this paragraph because it segues into the next one. Recollect the slogan, "United we stand." It was effectively used after 9/11 to launch a second Vietnam War, this time in the Middle East against Afghanistan and Iraq, while Wall Street bankers prepared to give us the worst stock market crash since 1929. I ask you, who was standing with whom? Why are we still paying while the war makers and the bankers are walking around free and rich instead of rotting in prison where they belong? A government no longer by the people is no longer a government for the people. Martin Luther King risked his life to inform us of this fact: wealth, poverty, racism, and war. Wealth, poverty, racism, and war. These four always go together. And we cannot solve one without solving the others. Robert Thurman, the great friend of the Dalai Lama and his translator. Robert Thurman, America's own homegrown bodhisattva, articulates a tragic truth. Quote, "We are led by lunatics." Perhaps Michael Parenti says it best. Quote, "The rich are never satisfied. They want it all. If you know that and nothing else, you still know more than all those people who know everything else, but not that." Unquote, Michael Parenti. Democracy cannot be sustained if its citizens are sleepwalking through history. The Renaissance offered the West a chance to regain its balance, as did the Enlightenment and the British, Dutch, American, and French revolutions. Alas, the time remained out of joint. Today, we have another opportunity. The spirit of the Renaissance rises anew. We can see it in the quantum, holistic, organic, transpersonal paradigm shift in philosophy, psychology, physics, biology, ecology, and spirituality. You're one of the luckiest generations of students ever to walk the planet, because you live in the midst of this renaissance of the Renaissance. Though the times increasingly try men's souls, this trial is another breakdown, breakthrough event. An opportunity, as Chogyam Trungpa would say, to recapture the sanity we were born with. The spirit of this transpersonal paradigm shift is expressed in what Toltec philosophy calls the rule. The first precept of the rule is that everything that surrounds us is an unfathomable mystery. The second precept of the rule is that we must try to unravel these mysteries, but without ever hoping to do so. The third precept is that a warrior on the path of knowledge, aware of the unfathomable mystery that surrounds him, and aware of his duty to try to unravel it, takes his rightful place among mysteries and regards himself or herself as one. Consequently, for a warrior on the path of knowledge, there is no end to the mystery of being, whether being means being a pebble or an ant or oneself. This is a warrior's humbleness. One is equal to everything. Unquote, Carlos Castaneda. We note a curious parallel here to what cognitive psychology calls the computational paradox. The computational paradox. The more that neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists discover that the mind is like a computer, the more they discover that the mind is not like a computer. Indeed, transpersonal psychology begins with the insight that Freud's so-called unconscious is, in fact, as Plato, Emerson, and Jung suspected, a consciousness, a higher consciousness. Max Weber was right. The disenchantment of the world leads to nightmare. The transpersonal re-enchantment of the world offers hope that history now opens into possibilities for peace rooted in a worldview of interbeing. Part 6. 2 more poems. 1. The option. Jesus, Buddha, Hillel, Buber, Gandhi, King. They all said the same thing. Their words fraught with provocative jewels hanging or not from the head of the mule. We brought up on Dylan and the Dead, heard the music and said, give peace a chance. 2, Planet Pledge. As some of you know, I rewrote the Pledge of Allegiance. It goes like this. And it's on posters.
Oh, I have slips of paper to hand out to everyone.
Okay, so you'll get it later, all right? So you don't have to write it down. Just open your mind and heart and see if you think that this rewritten Pledge of Allegiance is the one that ought to be taught to all our upcoming generation of children in school. Okay. I pledge allegiance to the planet and to all the people and creatures on her. One ecosystem, universally sacred, with nourishment and beauty for all. And now to conclude, part 7. Ask for the moon, you might get a rainbow in a seashell. Nitin Tracy, a contemporary scholar, Nitin Tracy asserts, quote, the day is not far off when enlightenment and liberation may be found included in the standard medical texts of psychology. And a liberated or enlightened person is seen not as a freak of nature, but as the most normal, sane, uncomplicated human being there can be, unquote. The secret meaning of relativity theory is that we are, in fact, all related. Einstein said, quote, separation is optical delusion, unquote. In sum, Personal identity is woven from the pulse of universal brother-sisterhood. Quantum theory has known this for 100 years. It is time for our culture to transform itself accordingly. I believe we can. I believe we will. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Thank you.